6:17 in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, let's deal with a bit of politics, shall we? With all that is going on in Trinidad and Tobago, we need to remind ourselves as well that the COVAX shipment is due to arrive just after 6 o'clock tomorrow, the Spiritual Chowta Baptist Liberation Day holiday. The vaccination rollout plan is scheduled to begin on April the 6th, that's next week. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley addressed the nation on Saturday during the Ministry of Health media conference. He touched on a number of areas, including the flouting of COVID-19 regulations as positive cases see a slight increase. And indeed, he more or less reinforced the messages that we've heard over and over. And if it might have sounded repetitive, I suppose the Prime Minister will feel that it's important to remind everyone of the need, even his own cabinet members, given the thing with Faris and so on, to do what is required to be done. But to give us a perspective on all of this, and indeed all of the issues surrounding governance in Trinidad and Tobago, the state of the economy, and the question about jobs and indeed job security in this very difficult economic time with COVID-19 still very much with us. We have with us now David Abdulah, political leader of the Movement for Social Justice. Very good morning to you, David. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, Fazeer. Morning to all of the viewers and listeners on TV6 Morning Edition.
Good to have you with us. And before we delve into these issues, correct me if I'm wrong, the election of officers for the MSJ is coming up soon?
Well, we had nominations on Friday last, and elections, had there been a contest, would have taken place on the 11th of April. But nobody challenged the team that I have the honor to lead, so that we were nominated and therefore elected unopposed. We will actually take office on the 18th of April when the Congress of the party approves the report of the Elections Committee. So we have a new team, about 5 persons or 6 persons who are coming in completely new to the executive, who will be members of the MSJ for some time. We have a balance of more women actually than men on the executive and a number of young people. So the party is regenerating, reinvigorating itself as we face the challenges ahead.
But is that a good thing to be virtually elected unopposed if you're talking about a vibrant organization? Isn't it a good sign of a divergence, of a healthy variance of views as far as the leadership of the MSJ? If you would have a challenge, if nobody's challenging, is there really any interest, any vibrancy in the MSJ?
There is vibrancy, but I suppose it reflects, I would look at it the other way around and say that it reflects a certain confidence by the members and the activists in the leadership of the party. I've met a number of persons over the last few months whom we haven't interacted with over a period of time, and they were all still committed and dedicated to the MSJ and to the leadership of the party. But as I said, we have a number of new members coming on to the executive, so that itself is a process of regeneration and reinvigoration.
So let's move into the active politics of the day right now in Trinidad and Tobago. COVAX, vaccines, issues about the Prime Minister's reminder to the nation, reinforcement of that message, much made about Faris Al-Rawi's involvement in an exercise where clearly those protocols were not observed as they should have been, calls for his removal as Attorney General, as you would expect from the opposition United National Congress, but many other issues related to the management of the economy in a very difficult time, made worse, of course, by COVID-19. What's your perspective?
Yes, and before I do that, I should have said at the very start my greetings to the members of the Spiritual Baptist faith. The holiday tomorrow, of course, recognizes the liberation from the banning of their religion by the colonial authorities. So I want to just send greetings to all the members of the Chowta Baptist faith in Trinidad and Tobago. Their example is an example of great struggle against the odds, against fighting the status quo and challenging the establishment and the elites of the society who viewed them as less than themselves and who therefore discriminated against their their religious practices. So let me just greet all the members of the Spiritual Baptist faith this morning. And then let me respond now to your question directly, Fazeer. I think that there are several fundamental issues. And of course, we could get sidetracked with the more minor ones. The Faris al-Rawi one, for example, is a more minor one. So the UNC made a big hue and cry with Mark with photographs yesterday in the media and so on. That's a more minor one. I think there are two fundamental questions. One is the vaccine, and secondly, the issue of the economy. Let me deal with the vaccine first. It's clear in my mind that the government has bungled badly the accessing by Trinidad and Tobago of sufficient vaccines to inoculate the population to the point where we can feel fairly comfortable in terms of what is now known, we now know as herd immunity. We feel fairly comfortable that there'll be very few new cases of COVID-19 in the country, and that persons who are entering from outside are not likely to cause us to get a spike in cases. And why do I say the government has bungled? Very, very early on, the government said they were going to be part of the COVAX arrangement through the WHO and PAHO and so on. And that was positive, that was good, that is necessary. But COVAX was never, ever going to guarantee sufficient vaccines in a short space of time, a relatively short space of time, to inoculate the majority of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, given that most of the vaccines require two shots, an initial one and then a booster shot. If you're talking about 800,000 people being vaccinated minimum, then you need to have 1.6 million doses. COVAX was only giving us 30-something thousand doses. So we needed to have moved with great speed last year, from the second or third quarter of last year, when the vaccines were coming on stream, to have sourced sufficient vaccines outside of the COVAX facility to ensure that we got the kind of immunity of the population that is required. And the government quite clearly failed to do that. All we were hearing about was COVAX, and nothing else. It was only when perhaps they were pushed by people, including the opposition, quite honestly, that they then made overtures to the Indian government, the Chinese government, and so on, and to the US and whoever else to try and obtain more doses of the vaccine. So in my view, the government dropped the ball badly. And what we heard essentially from the Minister of Health was a lot of old talk, a lot of rhetoric. I think one person yesterday referred to it as a big mama guy. So the Minister of Health really, should not be blabbering all the time, and should have been more focused on actually trying to obtain the vaccines. And so that is one major problem that the country faces, because even with the ones coming in the next few days, or tomorrow as the case may be, and people starting to be vaccinated the following week, that's only going to be 15,000 people, very, very limited. And we don't know when other vaccines are going to enter Trinidad and Tobago. So we may be talking about September, October, before or later, before we get significant numbers of persons in the country being inoculated. And that's not good. Let me then shift to the economy. While there are certain regulations...
Before you shift to the economy, David Abdulah, I understand what you said, talking about this whole management of the process. But wasn't the situation made many times worse by the attitude of the Prime Minister in his conversations thing with the public 2 Thursdays ago, when he essentially, there's this tone of, we're not in the business of begging, and more or less saying you don't vaccinate people by begging, essentially. Wasn't that the point at which this entire matter, as bad as it was, as much as the health minister would have been bungling the entire issue, that it was made many times worse and became a diplomatic incident as well by the attitude of the Prime Minister?
Yes, you're right. And what ought to have happened, so that the Prime Minister was trying to cover up the tracks by blustering his way through. And by blustering his way through, he actually did make the situation much worse, certainly diplomatically. Now, it seems that they were able to patch things up. I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amy Brown, is probably doing a lot of backroom, quiet diplomacy, trying to patch things up, and it seems that he was able to do so. But the approach by the Prime Minister was being wrong and strong, to use local parlance, being wrong and strong. He didn't get the vaccine, so you're now seeking to put the blame on others for why your government failed to get the vaccines. And that was playing wrong and strong, and that didn't help any of us in Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly didn't help the relations between Trinidad and Tobago and other countries, though they may have been patched up subsequently. You're right on that.
Yeah. So let's get to the issue of the economy. And again, we are constantly reminded that if you listen to the opposition narrative, it is all doom and gloom. The finance minister countered that last week by reminding everybody, at least on the numbers that he would be claiming to be correct, that the situation is much better than the opposition would wish to present it, and the government has faced a huge challenge over the past 6 years dealing with the irresponsible management of the economy as they see it, as the PNM see it, by the People's Partnership, and a situation made much worse by the arrival of the pandemic last year, which required the use of scarce and dwindling resources to lift people out of a desperate situation.
That narrative is true. However, there's another aspect of it that has to be addressed. And that is, when the government came in 2015, yes, the economy was not in great shape, but they then sought to put certain things in place that would have pointed a way forward. And they established the Economic Development Advisory Board. But the work of the EDAB, as the whole country knows, came to a screeching halt in early 2018, simply because the government wasn't taking us on. And therefore,
you were a part of that board, weren't you?
Approach, plan, strategy, action to stimulate the economy, to create growth, to diversify the economy. And because of that, therefore, the blame has to be put on the government for its failure to move the economy forward. And therefore, what they have been doing is simply trying to manage dwindling resources. Now, you could manage dwindling resources for a time, but if those resources continue to dwindle as our foreign exchange reserves have continued to dwindle, then at some point in time, there'll be nothing left to manage because there'll be no foreign exchange reserves left in the bank. And that is where we are going. That is a trend in which we are heading. And subsequent to COVID, because COVID became a reality, and it, it did impact very negatively on our economy, as it has impacted negatively on economies of countries all over the world. And unlike the United States, because you see the Biden administration rolled out a $1.9 trillion US COVID response to try and shore up people's salaries and a whole set of other things. And now they want to roll out a close to $3 trillion US stimulus, which will be infrastructure and jobs and some diversification and things like that. But the United States can do that because they can print money. Why can they print money and get away with it? Because the rest of the world consumes US dollars. So the US can do that. We in Trinidad and Tobago, we can't print money because then we will get hyperinflation and a whole set of other things that will be horrific for the people of the country. And therefore, when COVID hit us, the government set up a recovery team. Okay, they were to produce a roadmap. Okay, they produced it, but the country is unaware of what the roadmap is. So we don't know where we are going. And it seems as if the government itself doesn't know where it's going because there has been no actioning of that roadmap in a way that would stimulate new economic activity. And I think you had perhaps, you've had Mariano and Kevin Ramnarine and others speaking about the situation. And they've all pointed to the fact that unless we can have new productive activity, not just construction, which will help in the short term with some employment and some demand for hardware stores and whatever, but apart from construction and road works, there is no investment in activity that will create sustainable employment, that will earn us foreign exchange, or that will produce goods and services locally that we can substitute for imported items. And that is what is absolutely necessary at this time if we are to survive the next 3 years and come out of it in better shape than we are today. And we are not getting that from the government. And Mr. Imber could jump high, he could jump low. Dr. Rowley could say what he wants, but they have failed with respect to the recovery roadmap implementation, and they certainly failed with respect to the work of the Economic Development Advisory Board.
But David Abdulah, isn't it correct to say that all of these cries of doom and gloom we've been hearing for a number of years? We're saying, well, you know, the economy going to collapse, Trinidad and Tobago is a failed state, all of these things, and okay, the next boundary mark is 3 years hence, are we going to survive, and so on. And Trinidad and Tobago has survived. You wouldn't necessarily say prospered, but the fact is that our economic situation is far better than almost all of our Caribbean neighbors. I mean, we could argue where we should be, where we if we, with proper management, where a real functioning, vibrant economy would be given the resources that we've had. But if you were to look at the state of play as is, aren't we in a much better financial situation with reserves, with Heritage and Stabilization Fund, with, as the finance minister claims, unsolicited approaches for investment in Trinidad and Tobago? Aren't we in a much better position even now than our Caribbean neighbors?
Well, certainly we're in a better situation than some of our Caribbean neighbors. One of our closest neighbors, Guyana, I think is in a much better position than we are, because they have found huge reserves of oil, and they have other natural resources, gold and other natural resources, and they have a huge land mass and forests and so on, and acreages for agriculture that far exceed anything that we in Trinidad and Tobago can imagine. So Guyana is in a much better position than we are, and of course Guyana has a much smaller population. But let me say that, and other countries are managing the process better than we are. I think that Barbados is certainly managing the process in terms of consensus, though you see the private sector in Barbados kicking up against an increase in the minimum wage that the government wishes to implement. But generally speaking, there's been more agreement and consensus within the society in Barbados than there is in Trinidad and Tobago about what has to be done to stabilize the economy and then to move things forward. Certainly Barbados has done better than Trinidad and Tobago with respect to vaccinations of its population. Now, in terms of the economy doing relatively well, we have to measure that not only in the general statistical terms that economists use of gross domestic product or national income, and in terms of reserves, whether they be foreign exchange reserves or the stabilization and heritage fund. We ought not to simply measure it in terms of those macroeconomic data. We need to measure it in terms of the lives of people. And the reality is that the lives of tens of thousands of our people are getting worse in terms of their standard of living, their quality of life. And that is what we need to focus on, whether it is in terms of children who are falling behind in this online learning education system that we now have because they don't have devices yet, and you're now hearing the Minister of Education saying that some 20,000 laptops are now coming in and they're just going to start a means test. So a whole year has gone and thousands of children have not had access to online learning, either because of no device or no Wi-Fi and data and so on, or they have not been able to properly learn because there's no supervision at home, because their parents have to go to work, and therefore there's nobody at home to supervise and make sure that they're actually logged in and following the lessons and so on. So a lot of people are suffering in this context, and it is that against that benchmark that we have to measure how well we are doing. If you look at, for example, what the United States is doing, and I'm not suggesting the US is a gold standard by any means, but they were trying to ensure that persons, particularly the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, would get some access to resources to enable them to survive through this difficult time. And that is something that we have to find the ways and means of making sure that everyone is able to eat properly, that they could get employment, that their incomes can meet inflation, because most people's incomes have not gone up over the last 7-8 years, and prices have gone up. Transportation prices have gone up, food prices have gone up, and so on. So how do people, live a basic, decent life? If we're now going to be talking about increases to water rates and electricity rates, what is that going to do to the standard of living of the ordinary working man, woman, and their children, and to those who are unemployed, micro businesses, small businesses, and so on, fisher folk, farmers? How are they surviving in these times? I think those are the measures against which we have to judge how well the economy is doing.
David Abdulah, we have to pause for a moment. When we come back in the few minutes that we have, we'll put the focus squarely on the issue of labor and the labor environment as well, and indeed the unions and their level of advocacy, and indeed are they asking for things that are unrealistic in many respects. We'll chat about that in the few minutes that we have when we come back. As we go to the break, here's a reminder of the COVID-19 protocols. Wear a mask over the nose and mouth when you go out in public. Keep your distance from others. Stay home if you're ill. Clean and sanitize those hard surfaces, and wash your hands often with soap and water, or use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. We'll be right back.
So your children can get bus to go to school. The electric people you see.
6:41 in Trinidad and Tobago on this day, March 29th, when 40 years ago the country's first Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams, passed away. So it's 40 years ago today, March the 29th, when he died at the age of 69, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. But we have a few minutes left with David Abdulah, leader of the MSJ, re-elected unopposed to that organization. And in the time that we have available, David Abdulah, labor issues, and indeed unions, advocacy, representation of workers. Your perspective on that?
Yes, well, I think, a very significant event happened a few weeks ago when the entire labor movement decided to withdraw from the tripartite process, the National Tripartite Advisory Council. And they did so because their view was, and I agree with them 100%, that the government, as the major employer in the country, was not engaged really with the unions in a process that would suggest that the government is interested in tripartism, in some kind of agreement with labor and with business employers about how the burden of adjustments that have to be made, how those burdens will be shared going forward. In other words, the economic pie has shrunk. That is a fact. It was shrinking for the last several years, and COVID aggravated that, so the economic pie has shrunk. The question is, how is that pie going to be shared amongst the population? And if the pie is shrinking, but the share of those who control the economy, that their share is not actually getting any smaller, it means that more and more people have to now share a smaller and smaller part of the pie. And so the burden of adjustments really are falling on the backs of, as I was speaking before, of working people, the unemployed, people in small businesses, and so on. And in that situation, if that continues, the social tensions are going to rise. And the government ought to have addressed this situation by having frank discussions about how the burdens of adjustment will be shared going forward. And that essentially was what the Economic Development Advisory Board advised the government to do in January or February of 2016 in a note that we sent to the Prime Minister, suggesting how the tripartite process could best work in the context of the economic and social situation in the country. But that was, of course, ignored like all the other notes that we sent to the PM.
And just a final point, because I know you appreciate that the time is going by very quickly. Are the union's expectations realistic given the existing circumstances?
Well, the unions have been very patient because collective agreements for periods like 2012, 15, 15, 18, 18, 21, three collective bargaining periods have not been engaged in. There's been no negotiations for some cases three, some cases two collective bargaining periods. The unions have not been active, have not done anything to try to upset the apple cart in that regard. They've been very patient, but there's a limit to which you can take patience and turn that into disrespect. I think that is what the unions are saying, that you need to sit down with us, Mr. Government and employers, to discuss how we address these issues. You can't just say we're not talking. You can't just say, well, we have no money and there's nothing we can do. That's just not good enough. There has to be discussion, serious discussion, and open and honest discussion about how do we compensate workers fairly in this time? How do businesses get compensated fairly in terms of their profits? How do consumers get fair prices in this period? All of that needs to be discussed. How do we get the savings that exist in the economy into investment for new productive activities so we could create sustainable employment, earn foreign exchange or save foreign exchange? Those are the conversations that ought to be happening, and they're not happening, quite honestly.
David Abdulah, thank you very much as always for taking the time to offer your perspective in relation not just to the politics but the economy and so many other matters. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Good luck to West Indies in the second test.
Indeed. Let's see how that goes. Second test match starting this morning at 10 o'clock, weather permitting. Although I don't think they have anything like the weather that we're having right now in Trinidad and Tobago. Should be for an on-time start at 10 o'clock after the drawn first test match. Let's see how it goes with the second test between the West Indies and Sri Lanka. Well, as we go to the break, here's a floral image submitted by a viewer named Stephen. And now we present to you an orchid by Marva in Malabar. So a really nice combination of colors there with the Exora, the bright yellow kind of buttercup type of flower, and now for the purple of what I would presume to be, yes, an orchid from Marva in Malabar. Thank you very much for that as we go to the break.
No more.